All right, we are live here, Rick. All of a sudden, you popped up on the other side here as well. So I got us in the screen. This is a first time. This is a new show that we're doing here on YouTube for the U.S. national team, the Greco-Roman program. I'm Coach Matt Lindland, and I'm here with my good friend Dr. Rick Adante. And Rick is a professor of psychology, and he is a neuroscientist by trade. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background, Rick, and why I asked you to be on this show with me?
Sure. Hey, Matt. So my background is that, as you mentioned, I'm a neuroscientist. I did my PhD in neuroscience at UC Davis. I'm also a professor of psychology at Cal State San Bernardino and had a degree in psychology from the College of New Jersey. So kind of do a little bit of both, try to study the mind and the brain and how each of them kind of work together to support not just each other there, the mind and brain, but also, of course, us. How do we perform both physically in terms of our motor activity, but really how do we perform in terms of our cognitive and mental performance. Things like that is kind of how we look at things, and I look at it on the cognitive side with learning and memory. And we apply that stuff with brain states and all sorts of good stuff to try to understand how and why do we do the things that we do.
Okay, well, and that's kind of what this show is about, is not just character development and helping build better leaders within our program. And I thought, how do I best do this? Do I bring everybody into camp? Well, that's not really feasible to do something weekly where we're getting this information out, we're having discussions. And I think this is one of those projects where not only are we having discussions, but we're getting the wrestling community involved in this, specifically the national team athletes that we're sending to overseas tournaments, and especially our guys that are going to be representing us at the World Championships. We are trying to develop better leaders. And the reason I thought about doing this show was this is something that I wanted to do, was create better leaders within our program. How do we do that? I've been going back and forth, and I've actually had some guys reaching out to me and saying, Coach, I'm looking for some skills. I'm looking for things I can read, things I can learn to become a better leader. So now I've got guys asking about it. I'm giving books out. One of my favorite books to give out it's called The Defining Decade by Meg Jay. I don't think you've read that one yet, but I've talked to you a little bit about it. But I think the one that we're going to start discussing first is probably Above the Line by Urban Meyers. He's a football coach for the Ohio Buckeyes, and they've been pretty successful. He was also a coach in a number of other college football programs. But I think this first week, we just want to test out the equipment, see if we know how to do a Skype call. I downloaded some recording software. I figured out how to split screen. So if you're looking at this screen, if I did this right, it should be a split screen with me on one side and Rick on the other side. And so I wrote some notes here. You can tell I'm looking at my notes, but that's okay because this is my first show. But one of the things that really there's the way I look at it, there's three areas in the wrestling. There's the technical, there's the physical, which is your strength, your conditioning. Are you healthy? Are you strong enough? Are you well conditioned enough? And then lastly, the mental, which is the way we're approaching it here is leadership development and character development. And that's really what I want to get more into. And it's having the right mindset. Have you read the Carol DeWitt book, Mindset?
I haven't read it through, but I've talked with her a little bit about it on occasion, and it's a pretty interesting book.
Okay, so you've actually, she's one of your colleagues, and you've had discussions with her?
Yeah, briefly. We've crossed paths on a few occasions and had lunch and things like that.
That's interesting. So I want to hear about this. Tell me about. I've actually reached out to her on Twitter, DMing on Twitter back and forth a couple times, but not in person. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was fun. I mean, so one of the things we do in the field of neuroscience is there's a lot of efforts in academia sometimes to really build mentoring opportunities with people. And so a lot of times when we have visiting speakers come in and do lecture series and stuff like that, there's usually created opportunities for them to have lunch and speak with the graduate students, the undergraduate students, the postdocs, and kind of use that as sort of a visiting form mentorship. You can think of it not too differently as ways that we do that in the wrestling community when guys come in and give clinics or camps or things like that. It's great when the coaches are friends and we can all get together and go out, right? But it's a real benefit to the kids if that visiting clinician can go out to lunch with the kids on the team instead of their buddies and the coaches sometimes. And so that's kind of the context that I got to know her in when I was a trainee. She was one of the people that had kind of come through on that circuit, and it was a really good opportunity to get that insight from people as prominent as she was in the field, and see how she's approaching not just the research side, but how she's reaching out to the community through things like books and things like that to kind of spread that message at a broader level, which not always are we good at.
Well, her background's definitely in research, but she wrote not just that book, but I think she's actually got another book out as well that's just recently come out. I don't remember the title. I'm going to have to look that up for the next episode of this, because that was something I just recently came across. Was Carol had written a new book, and I wanted to get that as well. And I think one of the messages that we need to get across to some of these young athletes is leaders are readers. So constantly reading subjects, and also getting together with other people that are experts in the field. Not only are you getting together with experts in your field, but I'm talking about how the mind works, how we approach this psychologically. Because how many times have you heard wrestling is 90% mental or whatever the number is? Have you heard that statistic?
All the time. It's how I got into my entire profession and career. I was a high school wrestler and a college wrestler, and I was fascinated at what distinguished and delineated guys who had their hands raised and guys who just barely didn't. They're fantastic, incredible physical specimens out there, wonderful athletes who are incredible wrestlers, and something differentiates them from the guys who beat them and who are equally skilled physically. And I was always fascinated by that mental side. And when I started in school, it got me interested in what makes that mental toughness, that self-discipline, and that mental toughness to kind of persevere through and make those jumps across the gaps that your opponent might not, be it in training or maybe in the match, or win that 1-0 overtime, championship bout. It fascinated me and sent me down this whole rabbit hole of the last 15 years of psychological and neuroscience research, trying to understand that in various different ways. So I think what you said just hits the nail on the head in terms of leaders are readers, because that's something that I've even been reminded of in my career, where I remember I applied for a grant that ended up getting rejected, and I talked to the program officer at the National Institute of Health whose job is to administer these, incredibly expensive, $1 million grants and huge research programs. And she was asking for mentoring plans. And I said, yeah, but I didn't apply as a mentored candidate. I'm a faculty member now. And, my job is to mentor the students beneath me. So I think you had my application in the wrong category. And she's like, well, you're right. We probably had it in the wrong category, but that still means we expect a mentoring plan from you. That means contact other people in the field, more senior, who can still serve as resources and points of contact to continue to develop your career, because we expect constant career-long, lifelong mentoring. There's always somebody you can learn from, and she was absolutely right. And I think that if you're trying to speak to maybe the younger cohort of guys on USA Wrestling and other athletes, right? We get to a point where maybe you've won a junior world title, or you've won a couple NCAA titles, and you can headline your clinics, you can be a head coach here and there, but we forget sometimes that there's still contextually, that can still be just the beginning of the road, and there's so much more knowledge out there available to learn from the people who've gone before you and get that mentorship, whether it's in person, but if you can't talk to that person or see them on flow, you read about the people who've gone before you. What have they said? What have they experienced? What have they failed at? And to me, that's always just been a touchstone piece, delineating the people who are committed to really moving and succeeding at the next level, and going to the games, trying to win gold rather than happy to just be at the games.
So, I mean, one of the first topics that we could discuss in this show is how to get a mentor, what that mentorship looks like, how to find somebody that's been there, done that, and can kind of guide, be your Sherpa along the path that you're trying to get to. I mean, if we're trying to summit the mountain, which is speaking of summit, you've summited Mount Kilimanjaro, and we've talked about that before, and I think maybe we'll bring that up in future discussions. But I mean, these athletes are trying to summit, what it takes to get to the top of the podium, at not just the Olympic Games, but what is that mindset? And I'm looking to find more and more talented athletes to be a part of our Greco-Roman program. And recently, I just got back from a trip in Estonia, and I was with a lot of younger athletes, cadets, and even some schoolboys over there. And a lot of those guys, when you talk to them, what's your goal? They talk about winning state titles. And I don't think there's enough great mentors out there that are aspiring these young athletes to reach higher than what a state title is. I mean, there's state titles. Every state other than a few like California, New York, and New Jersey have multiple state champions at multiple weight classes and 4 or 5 different classes. That's not. I mean, it's a great accomplishment, no question. It's something that I never achieved as a wrestler was a state title. But how many of those guys are actually looking at the bigger picture of standing on the podium at the World Championships or the Olympic Games?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge point. I grew up wrestling in Illinois, and in our little culture at the time, that state title was the Olympic title in your mind. And that's, looking back now, right, 25 years later, you see how limiting that is as a mindset. And you asked about, the things that differentiate guys and how are they looking at things different. That's something that, I've probably spent the last 20, 25 years of my life just kind of being a huge nerd and sort of a bookworm about, because I've been fascinated by that drive. And so I've tried to find people out like you, Matt, and so many other guys, and figure out what's ticking up here that's driving the kind of behavior and performance that you guys are achieving. And one of the things that I've been kind of really surprised about is, if you talk about some of these younger athletes looking to stand on top of those big podiums where their goals should be, right? Like the Olympics, the Worlds, things like that. I think that, so contextually I work in academia, I work in the college world, right? So they don't always work with world champs and athletes all the time. So sometimes there's a stereotype of like the dumb jock or whatnot that people think are these champions. And so I've been really surprised in my experience, traveling the world and getting to meet these people at the top of their respective domains, be it wrestling or professional things in aviation or science or whatever, right? We think that a lot of these gold medalists and champs, that they might be this heavy alpha male sort of jock, super cocky and confident. And one of the things I've just seen anecdotally and exuded by yourself too, by the way, is that's kind of the opposite of, I think, what it tends to be of what I've seen. The guys at the top of the podium, they tend to be, when you get past the bluster and sometimes maybe that outside exterior, when you actually talk to them, there's a humility there, and part of that humility is usually driving that need to learn, to read, to learn about what else can I know, because I don't know it all. I'm not good enough yet. I always want to be getting better. And I think that was a striking discovery for me, because I didn't just see that in wrestling. I've known wrestlers for 20 some odd years. The humility in a lot of wrestlers at that core level sometimes. But what was surprising to me was seeing it at the top levels of science, Nobel Prize winners, fighter pilots, everything across the board. You got to cut through that exterior surface a little bit. There might be a little bit of, some bluster on the outside, pretty confident people sometimes, but like you said, what are guys doing to get to the top? Usually they're riding that that humility train as far as they can for good reason, because it helps to learn. It drives the learning, and it kind of keeps our ego in check, so it's not tripping us up from learning more and being able to reach that podium that you're looking for.
Well, I think what you're talking about, if I'm hearing you right, is, first of all, you have to conceive what you want to accomplish. You have to believe it in your head. You have to be able to visualize that you're standing on that podium. You've getting your hand raised, or you're getting this award, or whatever it is in the scientific field or the academic field. But in the wrestling field, we're talking about standing on top of the podium at some of the biggest events, the World Championships, the Olympic Games, getting your hand raised. So you have to be able to conceive that before you can actually get to the point where you're doing those things. So a lot of what I'm trying to go back and think about, how did I get to that point? I think it was I had great coaches that always asked me to aspire for more, that asked me to visualize, to believe that I could achieve something. And why should I? I wasn't an athlete that won a state title. I wasn't a guy that had all these accolades, that was getting recruited to D1 colleges, straight out of high school. I was somebody that went to a junior college, but at the same time, I had that belief, because I had certain coaches that inspired me to believe that way, to believe that I could accomplish more. And then also have the humility to understand that I haven't done anything yet in this sport, and to keep the, Bruce Lee always said, have a white belt mentality, and to learn from everybody, and to constantly, we talk about mentors in our field, but also to learn from even your students. I mean, I'm sure there's many examples where students have brought up questions, or even answers that you were like, made you think.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's one of the things I think sometimes my students get frustrated with. They get surprised because they'll ask me questions about something in class, about neuroscience, and especially introductory level classes. And I'll say, I don't know. That I don't know that anybody in the field knows the answer to that particular question, because we're still trying to understand a lot about the brain. Or I don't know because we do know a lot about the brain. I haven't had a chance to get to that section yet. And I think that when you get an 18-year-old, freshman year in college, and you want to go to med school or get good grades, you want to be told exactly what the right answer is by the expert who's up there talking to you, and to be able to see, I think, that reality, right? That we're still learning, that there's still a lot more to learn. I remember I've recently seen some of these old videos of like Dave Schultz teaching people in clinics, and him to see this world Olympic champion talking about, oh yeah, I think this works like this, or do this and this, but to see that he's not pretending to know everything in the world, that was really educational for me.
And definitely that comes with that humility, and that's why Dave was very successful at what he did and everything he did, and that's why the most successful guys, that Kevin Jackson, the Kendall Crosses, the people that we've looked up to that have been champions in our sport, have kept that humble, mindset of, how do I learn? And you're right, Rick, about young students, is they want to know the answers, and the answers, maybe this is the answer for me, but I don't know the answer for you. It's like, where does my hand go? Where does my foot go? How do I execute this? And a lot of this stuff is first of all, it's conceiving that you can do this, and it's believing that you can do it. But the achievement part really comes down to them executing their own strategies, their own plans, and being creative. I talk about, a lot of my athletes in the sense of being artists and being martial artists. And there's no right or wrong way to do art. If we look at art, it's, how do you appreciate art? And that's really, you have to understand that there is science in there. We're talking about leverage and fulcrums and angles of attack, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of art that goes into our sport. And if you can make it work differently and better, then you've evolved our sport. You've made it better. And I don't think that a lot of young guys understand that concept yet. They want to do it like the champion before them did it instead of do it like the champion they could become.
Well, have you ever coached? So, a question for you, right? And this is rhetorical, but so have you ever coached or competed against a guy who was a robot? No, of course not, right?
No,
they're not. They're not robots.
No.
So, like you said, guys are looking for answers. What do I do in this position? And there's going to be answers, right? You're a coach. You know that there's answers. Do this in this position. Definitely don't do this other thing. But at the same time, like you said, especially guys starting off, these younger guys trying to build those careers, I think that turning point of realizing that context really matters, that you're not going to wrestle and fight against a robot, and you can't be a robot. And what I mean by that is that there's a guaranteed answer. Every time this happens, do this. Because context matters. Realizing that things are going to change situationally. You know, a move that might work 80% of the time on, you know, just about everybody, one of your opponents, still might not work on that really funky guy. Or that guy who's, you know, just a tank and just physically you can't move. Might not be funky at all, right? You just can't move the guy.
Yeah.
But when guys realize that there is that, you've got to adjust and like you said, make it the art from the science, and that there is context that's going to change. It's going to be situational sometimes what you might do. And I don't know how you learn that other than putting in thousands and thousands of hours of not just practice and competition, right? Experiencing those different situations, experiencing losing from trying the wrong thing in one of those situations, but thousands of hours, you know, seeking that guidance of experience from you who's already put in, you know, even tens of hundreds of thousands of hours more, so they can soak up. And it's got to think of it like a video game, right? You can do a warp zone to a whole nother level, right?
Okay.
That would take.
I'm not much on big video games, but I'm sure a lot of our audience will be.
Yeah, so you can warp from like level 1 to like level 7 by like taking a little tunnel, I think in like Mario Brothers or something, right? So if it might take me 30 years to learn a bunch of information, what if I put, you know, those hours into learning from what you've learned from your 30 years first?
And
so now
you show you that tunnel to the warp zone to raise you, you know, multiple levels, you know, in a shorter period of time to expedite that learning process. But again, it comes back to having that humility to seek out those mentors and seek out not just one coach has the answer. I mean, there's thousands of coaches out there that could guide you in a different direction. You're going to get all this different feedback. And that's another thing I hear a lot of times. Well, my coach told me to do it this way, or so-and-so showed me like this. Yes, that could work too. That could work in that situation. This could work in a different situation. And all those things can work differently. I mean, not everybody can do a side lift like Roman Vlasov. I mean, I never did, you know, and there was only really one guy doing that. Iskandarian was the only guy doing a side lift, you know, 20 years ago when I was on the mats, you know, competing. Was it 20 years ago? Something like that. Something like that. Yeah, 18 years ago, I think was the last time I was you know, on the big stage of the mats like that. But you know, there wasn't that many people doing side lifts, and you see Roman do it. And you go, well, how does he do it? I want to do it like him. But you're 3 feet taller than Roman Vlasov, or you're stockier, or you're bigger, or whatever it is. And if you want to do a side lift, you have to figure out how to do it like you can do it. Or you have to, maybe your body can't do a side lift. I can think of an example for me. I wanted to learn how to do a reverse lift. I never, ever learned how to do a reverse lift. I didn't have the strength, the ability, the speed, the athleticism, whatever it was. You know, I never was able to do a reverse lift technique. I actually lost my straight lift. You want to hear the story?
Yeah,
I spent a year trying to develop a reverse lift to add this to my repertoire of wrestling. And in the process, I give myself a year. Once the year was over, I was like, you know what, I'm gonna go back to hitting my straight lifts. And what happened in that time frame was I almost lost how to do a straight lift. I couldn't lift somebody for about 6 months. This is the period leading up to the. What's that? I lost you.
Can I put my nerd hat on for?
Yeah.
I want to ask if you're going to broadcast this, right? I'm going to assume that there might be some people out there that might not know what a reverse lift is. If you had to tell them what it is that you're not being able to do, that you're struggling with, that you're trying to figure out.
Okay, do we got to put up an image of a reverse lift? Add a video of one of the greatest guys ever doing it, or
you're basically trying to pick somebody up and throw their feet over their head.
Yes, but a straight lift, you're trying to do the exact same thing, but you're grabbing the trunk and your head's facing the same direction. A reverse lift, your head's facing his feet, and you're still grabbing him by the trunk. So it's the same principle that I'm trying to do. Pick a man up that doesn't want to be picked up, throw him over your head, and expose his back.
Yes, so it's really, really freaking hard.
And you're trying to do it to the best guys in the world. It makes it extremely difficult, yes. So I never did develop this technique. And then when I got back to giving up and going, you know what, maybe that technique's not for me, I'm just going to go back to my straight lift. I'd lost my straight lift. But in that time frame, I'd start to do this high chest lift that you can see my matches from the Olympic Games where I executed that high chest lift in multiple matches. So, I don't know if that was time I didn't spend properly, or if it was time I spent doing something, and I ran the course and then said, you know what, I come back and I started to learn that high chest lift, and all of a sudden that thing worked for me because in the meantime I'd lost my straight lift. Does that make sense to you at all? Is anybody listening to this going to understand what I'm talking about?
I think so. I mean, I think one of the things I get from it is just like, if I bring it back to what you were saying earlier, which was, that drive to learn stuff and try new things. And sometimes you don't know how that's going to come back and help you or create a new door or a new way that you might innovate something. And maybe you give something up along the way for that. Maybe that changes the way you did something before. But, I think of like there's a classic story of what helped make Steve Jobs initially get a little market edge for when he was building Apple. Was he had, I think he dropped out of college, and I might butcher part of the story, but the generic gist was he left a certain college and he had to take some community college classes, and he ended up taking a calligraphy class basically just for fun. He was interested. It had no bearing on what he thought he might do in his career or how it might fit, but he started learning that just because there was this drive to learn and use it. And one of the things that then fast forward that he integrated into Apple at the time that nobody was doing that gave a market advantage was he gave the option to use different fonts, which, might seem normal now, but back in, the 80s or whatever that was a big innovation against the competitor like Microsoft at the time. And so,
you're absolutely right. Now we take for granted that there's 1,000 different fonts we can use in different sizes, but you're absolutely right. There were, in the beginning, some of the people that are watching this don't remember those times when we didn't have computers or we didn't have internets. But yeah, absolutely, that's very cool.
So I mean, if you're going out maybe trying to learn a new move or just wrestling for fun and trying to see what works, right? You don't know where, So again, thinking, you got guys who, might be great folk style wrestlers as kids in America, but, go out and try some Greco, go to the camps, do Greco or try a different style. Cause maybe you end up in a match later on and say folk style in your state championship match or whatnot, where maybe something that you learn just for fun with Greco in the off season or something, maybe that comes back, that gives you that match. Maybe you find a guy that you're able to catch and you get that your hips in and can do some sort of a lift or a throw that saves you a match that you might have lost. That drive to learn, to be studying, to do all that kind of stuff, I guess, that we were talking about is, I don't know, that's kind of what I picked up from what you were talking about your lifts.
Well, I think you summarized it up pretty well for me, and that's why I think it's great that we're going to be able to do this show together. And I think this first one today that we're doing is a good test. We've gone about 34 minutes on this call, and I think the lessons that I've taken away that I think is stay humble, continue to experiment, and staying humble. Again, I'll say that again, but just being creative and having fun, because I heard you use the language play with that, experiment with that, and that's the same kind of language I like to use. And when I'm hearing it come from a neuroscientist, it makes even more sense to me, and hopefully it makes sense to our listeners. And I think we can probably cut this episode now and see if we can get better at this, Rick, and get a little more organized. But I just downloaded the software, the Skype, and now hopefully the screens are split. Hopefully it recorded. We're going to give this a shot.
That sounds awesome, Matt. I'm really looking forward to it. Every time you're talking about any of this stuff, I'm thinking about, what's happening between the neurons when how much better are they forming connections when they're learning something because they're trying to play as opposed to being forced, right? There's neurotoxic effects of stress that stop those brain connections from being formed as well as when they're able to engage in free exploration and play, right? I mean, every time you talk about all this stuff, I'm just coming up with ideas for more and more shows. And
we'll write those down because I want to get into some of that stuff, and I want to talk about play, and I want to talk about how the brain responds to that, and maybe we'll even get into some political debates, because I think that a lot of the public education goes the wrong directions. They inhibit play and exploration, and they try to force conformity, and I mean that's basically how our system of education was developed to conform students, not athletes, to conform students. And what we're talking about is nonconformity, experimentation, play, having fun. I think those are all things that are going to be discussed in this show and help our athletes understand not only how they can be better on the mat, be better off the mat. Don't you think that understanding leadership and having good character off the mat is going to help them perform better on the mat, though, ultimately?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they say that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So my hammer that I work with every day, that's the brain, that's the mind. So I think of all this stuff that you're talking about in that sort of neural context. So that transfer of function. So having good leadership, good character off the mat. Well, what does it take to kind of have those things, right? Well, it takes some personal discipline, right? We got to stop ourselves sometimes, maybe from saying something that we shouldn't say, or maybe from doing something that we shouldn't do, and maintain, the right conduct. Who you want to be as a man, as a person, right? That takes establishing goals, working towards those goals, avoiding the temptations away from those goals. And when you practice that stuff, you're developing certain neural patterns, right? You're developing the connections between the areas that are serving those tasks of delayment of gratification, of staying that discipline, of avoiding those temptations. Well, those pathways are going to be strengthened. And you asked about that transferring to the mat, to athletic success. And I can't think of a way where it wouldn't, because those are things you're going to need to stay disciplined and move towards those goals. Go to practice on the days you don't want to go to practice. Keep that mental discipline. Don't give into that temptation, to eat that garbage food that's going to make you perform like garbage, or have to cut that extra weight instead of healing up. Or within a match, keep that mental discipline to hold on to that leg for 4 more seconds, or keep bridging for 3 more seconds before the period's up. There's so many layers when you talk this stuff, Matt, it's like music in my ears. There's absolutely that stuff.
Well, I think we can have a lot of fun with this, and I want to get into some more of this discussion on how important self-talk is to the brain, how important self-image is to our athletes, having the right self-image, having the right self-talk, conversations. Who do we talk to more than ourselves, and what we're saying to ourselves, how important are those type of things? And we get into those discussions later on. and also the idea of gratitude and the idea of humility and how those affect us on and off the mat. I think there's going to be a lot of fun getting into this discussion. And so let's try this again. Let's see if this one recorded and worked, and I'll get it up posted if it did, and we'll have another discussion soon, Rick.
That sounds great, Matt. Thanks for the chance to talk.
Thank you.